focus of all those documentaries and Hollywood movies. But there's one version of Titanic we have never seen until this morning.
For the first time, we have an exact digital copy of the real thing.
For 113 years, the ocean kept its secrets. Deep in the North Atlantic, in water so cold and dark that sunlight has never touched it, the wreck of the RMS Titanic has rested at a depth of approximately 3,800 meters, nearly 2.5 miles beneath the surface. Divers have gone down. Cameras have captured blurry corridors and collapsing decks. Museums have displayed recovered artifacts. Films have dramatized the final hours. We told ourselves the story was complete. It was not. In 2025, a team of researchers, engineers, and marine archaeologists did something no expedition before them had ever attempted. They did not simply visit the Titanic. They rebuilt it, digitally, completely, and with an accuracy so precise that it permanently overturned more than a century of assumptions. What they found in the process is not just a new chapter in the Titanic story. It is a full rewrite. If you believe you already know what happened on the night of April 14, 1912, prepare to reconsider everything. To understand why this expedition was different, you need to understand everything that came before it. Since the wreck was first located in 1985 by Robert Ballard and his team, dozens of missions have ventured to the site. They brought cameras, robotic submersibles, and retrieval equipment. They brought scientists and historians and, controversially, treasure hunters. Over the decades, a picture slowly assembled itself, the bow lying upright in the silt, the stern collapsed and broken several hundred meters away, a vast debris field stretching between them. By the early 2000s, it seemed reasonable to assume the wreck had given up most of its meaningful secrets. That assumption was wrong for a simple reason. No single previous mission had ever seen the entire wreck at once. Every prior expedition looked at pieces. A camera passing over the bow. A submersible descending into a corridor. Photographs taken from specific angles at specific moments. It was like trying to understand a cathedral by examining it through a keyhole, one section at a time, on different days, in different lighting. The full picture was never assembled because the tools to assemble it did not yet exist. In 2025, they finally did. The expedition was built around a technology called photogrammetry, a process in which hundreds of thousands of overlapping photographs are processed by specialized software to reconstruct a three-dimensional model of extraordinary precision. The team deployed multiple deep-sea robotic vehicles simultaneously, each carrying high-resolution cameras, sonar equipment, and laser scanning arrays. For weeks, they worked in a methodical grid pattern across the entire wreck site, capturing the bow, the stern, the debris field, and everything in between from every possible angle and elevation. The result was more than 700,000 individual photographs, 16 terabytes of raw visual data, and a complete digital replica of the Titanic wreck. A twin so accurate that researchers could measure the gap between individual rivets, red faded manufacturer stamps on machinery, and trace the precise path a deck chair had traveled as the ship broke apart. When the first complete renderings appeared on researchers' screens, those who had spent careers studying the Titanic fell silent. What they were looking at was not just a more detailed image of what they already knew. It was evidence that contradicted the story they had been telling for generations. The first and perhaps most significant revelation concerns the nature of the original damage, the collision itself. For decades, the dominant narrative held that the iceberg tore a massive, dramatic gash along the Titanic's hull. Early theories even suggested a single catastrophic wound hundreds of feet long. When those estimates were revised downward by later research, the image that persisted in popular culture was still one of a violent, singular rupture, a wound that immediately sealed the ship's fate. The 3D scan dismantles that narrative with clinical precision. What the digital model reveals along the Titanic's starboard side is not a gash. It is a series of 6 slits, thin, almost surgical incisions running along the hull at intervals across nearly 300 feet of the ship's lower forward section. Some of these openings are no wider than a few centimeters. Individually, each one appears almost trivial. Together, they were lethal. The implications of this finding are profound. The Titanic was not stabbed. She was perforated. Water entered not through one catastrophic breach but through a series of small, persistent openings that steadily overwhelmed one compartment after another. The ship's designers had built her to survive the flooding of 4 watertight compartments. The iceberg comprised 6. That margin, 2 compartments, a difference measured in meters of damaged hull, was the difference between survival and catastrophe. This is what researchers are now calling death by 1,000 cuts, a phrase that captures both the mechanical reality of the flooding and its cruel pacing. The Titanic took roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink after striking the iceberg. The digital scan now shows why. She was not overwhelmed in an instant. She was steadily, inevitably drained. And while she drained, something extraordinary was happening below her waterline. Something the world had almost entirely forgotten. The Titanic was not merely a floating hotel. She was a floating power station. Her engineering spaces occupied a vast labyrinth in the ship's lower decks. 29 boilers, more than 150 furnaces, massive triple-expansion steam engines of a scale rarely built before or since. These spaces were operated by hundreds of men who worked in 12-hour shifts in conditions that bordered on brutal. Extreme heat, deafening noise, and the constant physical demand of shoveling coal, managing pressure, and maintaining the mechanical systems that powered everything above them. On the night of April 14th, as passengers in the first-class saloon continued to dine and dance, the men in those engine rooms were already fighting a battle no passenger would ever see. The 3D scan provided forensic investigators with an unprecedented view of those lower decks. And what they found there rewrote the story of Titanic's final hours more powerfully than almost any other discovery in the data. In boiler room number 2, researchers identified metal grating that had buckled inward from sustained heat and pressure. The direction and nature of that deformation told a precise story. The boilers in that compartment had continued burning long after water began entering the space. The only explanation, engineers concluded, was that the men assigned to those boilers had refused to abandon their posts. As water rose around them, they continued their work. Think carefully about what that means. Every extra minute that boiler burned kept the ship's dynamos running. Every running dynamo kept the electrical system alive. Every live electrical circuit meant lights in the corridors, power to the pumps fighting the rising water, and the ability of officers on deck to maintain some semblance of order during the evacuation. The lifeboats were launched in sequence, in relative light, with at least partial coordination, and that coordination was only possible because the lights stayed on. The lights stayed on because men in flooded engine rooms kept the fires burning. Survivor Lawrence Beasley, a second-class passenger who survived in Lifeboat 13, later wrote in his account that the sight of the ship's lights, steady against the black ocean, gave those in the lifeboats a strange sense of calm. For over a century, that detail was treated as a poignant memory, a footnote to the larger tragedy. The digital scan reveals it as something far more significant. Hard evidence of a conscious, deliberate choice made by men who knew they were sacrificing their own survival to extend the survival of others. As forensic investigators worked deeper into the digital model, they uncovered 2 specific pieces of physical evidence that had never been documented by any previous expedition. The first was a steam valve. Discovered in the wreckage of the stern section, the more heavily destroyed of the 2 halves, the valve was found locked in the open position. This was not damage. This was a setting. In maritime engineering, this particular valve served as the connection between the boilers and the ship's electrical generators. Holding it open under the conditions of that night, rising water, failing structural integrity, the certainty of death, required someone to make an active decision and carry it out. Metallurgical analysis of the surrounding components confirmed that the decision was made late in the sinking, well after the lower decks had begun to flood. The second discovery was in the wiring. Forensic electrical engineers examining the 3-dimensional model found patterns of scorch marks and overload damage near the ship's forward power station that could not be explained by simple flooding or structural failure. The damage followed a recognizable pattern. Backup circuits had been activated, and current had been deliberately rerouted through them as primary systems failed. Someone, or more likely, a small team of engineers working in coordination, had manually extended the ship's electrical grid minute by minute as the primary systems went offline, patching one failing connection after another to keep the lights burning across the ship above them. Some of those wires had been fused by heat. The water was at their knees when the last connections were made. Engineers working with the scan calculated that if those generators had failed even 10 minutes earlier than they did, Titanic's evacuation would have looked entirely different. There would have been no light on the boat deck, no power for the wireless station, which continued sending distress signals until nearly the end. The organized launch of lifeboats, imperfect, inadequate, but real, would likely have collapsed into blind chaos. The difference between approximately 700 survivors and a potentially smaller or larger number can be traced, in part, to those fused wires in the darkness. One engine crew survivor, a coal trimmer named Walter Hurst, gave a testimony that had long been cited but never fully understood. He described the sound of water entering the ship as like thunder, the noise as overwhelming, and the general situation as chaos, but said that the engineers around him remained calm and continued working. He described watching men he knew making choices they understood to be final. He survived. Most of them did not. His account, cross-referenced with the physical evidence now visible in the digital scan, fits precisely. The burn patterns, the valve position, the rerouted circuits, all of it lines up with the testimony of a man who watched the engineering crew of the Titanic choose duty over survival and carry that choice through to the end.